The year was 1878, and the silence of the high meadows was a living thing. For Esther Weston, it was a constant companion, a presence that had long ago replaced the sound of her husband's voice. Her cabin, nestled in a fold of the foothills, was a solitary outpost against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, a place she rarely visited, a place that had all but forgotten the quiet woman on the old western claim. Her life had shrunk to the dimensions of this small plot of land, a world defined by the rhythmic chop of an axe, the rustle of wind through pines, and the ghosts of memory that haunted the corners of her small home. Esther was a widow. The word itself felt brittle, like a dead leaf. Walter had been gone for 2 winters, taken by a fever that had burned through him with the speed and fury of a forest fire. He had left her with this land, a place he'd loved with a fierce possessiveness, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight in her chest. She had learned to carry it. She had learned to mend her own fences, hunt her own game, and stare into the flames of her hearth at night without weeping. She was resilient, not by choice, but by necessity. Her days were a litany of chores, a steady routine that kept the deeper currents of grief from pulling her under. She moved through her life with a capable, stoic grace that masked the profound isolation eating away at her soul. Her world was one of resignation, a quiet agreement she had made with fate. She expected nothing more than what she had, the turning of the seasons, the ache in her bones when the cold set in, and the crushing stillness of the nights. She was a woman frozen in time, held captive by a past she could not change, and a future she could not imagine. It was on a late summer afternoon, when the sun bled gold across the valley, that the silence was finally broken. She was down by the creek that cut through the lower pasture, gathering smooth stones to shore up the edge of her garden when she saw it. A smudge of color against the green bank, something that did not belong. At first, she thought it was a deer, fallen and broken, but as she drew closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, the shape resolved itself into the form of a man. He was a Cheyenne warrior, that much was clear from the beads in his dark hair and the make of his buckskin leggings. He was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for the water that trickled just beyond his grasp. A dark, ugly stain spread across his back and side, a wound that was still weeping blood into the thirsty earth. He was utterly still. For a long moment, Esther stood frozen, the stones dropping from her numb fingers. Every instinct, every warning she had ever heard from the fearful folk in town, screamed at her to turn and run. He was the enemy, the savage, the reason settlers bolted their doors at night. But as she stared at his still form, another, deeper instinct took hold. He was not a threat, he was a man, dying on her land. His vulnerability was a silent plea that transcended fear and prejudice. Leaving him here was a death sentence. Hesitantly, she moved forward and knelt beside him. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for the faint, thready flutter of life. It was there, a fragile pulse beating against her skin. In that moment, a choice was made. The quiet resignation of her life was shattered. She could not let him die. With a strength born of desperation, she heaved his dead weight onto her shoulders and began the arduous journey back to the cabin, her world irrevocably altered with every painful step. For 3 days, the man, Vokin, existed only as a vessel of fever and pain. Esther moved around him in a state of heightened tension. The old rifle Walter had left her always within reach. She had dragged him onto her own bed, as it was the only soft place in the cabin, and worked with a grim determination she hadn't felt in years. She tore strips from her own linen sheets for bandages, boiled water for cleaning the wound, a deep, jagged gash that looked to have been made by a hunter's knifey, and brewed bitter willow bark tea by dins for thiever, forcing the liquid past his cracked lips. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, was now filled with the sound of his labored breathing and the low, guttural moans that escaped him during the worst of the fever dreams. She was a stranger to him, and he to her. In those first days, Her actions were purely functional, a clinical response to a physical need. She was not nursing a man, she was fighting a death. She was wary, watching his face for any sign of waking, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. What had she done? What trouble had she invited over her threshold? When he finally woke, it was without warning. His eyes, dark and deep as a forest pool, snapped open and fixed on her. The fever had broken, but a sharp, intelligent awareness had taken its place. He said nothing. He simply watched her, his gaze tracking her every movement as she stoked the fire, his expression unreadable, guarded. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was a taut wire stretched between them, humming with suspicion. They had no words. His language was a mystery to her and hers to him. Communication became a careful, deliberate dance of gesture and observation. When she brought him a bowl of broth, he would watch her hands, her face, before slowly reaching for it. When he needed to rise, a slight inclination of his head was his only request. She would help him, her touch firm and impersonal, and he would accept her aid with a stoic stillness that revealed nothing. It was an uneasy truce, a coexistence born of his profound weakness and her reluctant, stubborn compassion. She saw the warrior in the hard lines of his face and the coiled strength in his body, even as he lay injured. He, in turn, saw a lone white woman, an anomaly in this wild land, and he did not yet know if she was his savior or his captor. Days bled into a week, and a fragile rhythm began to establish itself in the small cabin. The taut wire of suspicion slowly began to slacken, replaced by a quiet, watchful understanding. Vokin's strength returned in small increments. First, he was able to sit up on his own, his back straight and proud, despite the pain that surely lingered. Then, he was walking, limping slowly around the confines of the single room, his eyes taking in every detail of her life, the worn rocking chair where she mended clothes, the small shelf of Walter's books she could not bring herself to discard, the faded photograph of a smiling couple on the mantelpiece. He began to contribute in small, silent ways. One afternoon, he took a piece of kindling and, with a small knife she had left on the table, began to carve. By evening, he had fashioned a new, more efficient handle for her water bucket. Another day, as she struggled to set a snare near the woods, he came up behind her and, with a few deft movements of his hands, showed her how to tie a knot that was both simpler and more effective. He never spoke, but his actions were a language all their own, a language of competence and shared existence. The sharing of meals became their most important ritual. They would eat in silence, sitting at the small wooden table, the fire crackling in the hearth. But the silence was different now. It was less a barrier and more a shared space. It was in these moments that Esther found herself breaking her own long-held silence. Knowing he could not understand the words, she began to talk to him. She told him about Walter, about the dreams they had for the land, about the crushing weight of her loneliness since his passing. The words poured out of her, a confession to the uncomprehending air, a release of pressure that she hadn't known she was holding. He would just listen, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his expression softening with an empathy that seemed to transcend language. He might not have understood the words, but he understood the sorrow. He saw the grief that clung to her like a shroud. One evening, a storm rolled in, the wind howling like a grieving animal and rattling the very bones of the cabin. A sudden, sharp clap of thunder made Esther jump, a small cry escaping her lips. In the flickering firelight, she saw Vokin flinch, his hand going to his side where the wound was healing. In his eyes, for a fleeting moment, she saw not a stoic warrior, but a man haunted by his own pain, his own losses. The barrier between them crumbled a little more. She saw his humanity, and he saw her fear. A few nights later, the ultimate test of their fragile trust arrived. A cougar, drawn by the scent of the smoked meat hanging outside, began to circle the cabin. Its scream ripped through the night, a terrifying sound that sent a chill down Esther's spine. She grabbed the rifle, her hands trembling. But before she could unbolt the door, Vokin was on his feet. He took a burning brand from the fire, his movements swift and economical. Ignoring her panicked gesture to stay, he opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. There was a furious snarl, a shower of sparks as he thrust the flame forward, and then a heavy thud as the cougar retreated into the trees. He returned to the cabin, his face grim but calm, and bolted the door behind him. He had placed himself between her and the danger without hesitation. In that moment, she stopped seeing him as a wounded man she was caring for. She saw him as a protector. He was no longer just a presence in her home, he was a partner in her survival. The fragile peace they had built was not destined to last. It was shattered by the arrival of two men, trappers by the look of them, their faces weathered and their eyes holding a mean, calculating glint. Their names were Amos and Garrett Callahan, brothers who roamed the high country with a proprietary air, viewing anything and anyone weaker than them as theirs for the taking. They had seen the smoke from her chimney and approached her cabin with an unwelcome familiarity. "Just checking on the widow," Amos said, his voice a gravelly drawl as he leaned against her porch railing, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Gets lonely out here for a woman on her own." Esther stood in the doorway, the rifle held loosely but purposefully in her hands. "I'm fine, Mr. Callahan, I need nothing." Garrett, the larger and more brutish of the two, peered past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "Smells like you got company," he grunted, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He had noticed the extra bowl on the table, the scent of the herbs she used for Vokin's poultice. "Got a secret, have we, Mistress Weston?" The air grew thick with menace. Esther's heart pounded. She knew these men, knew their reputation for cruelty. They represented the very prejudice and violence that she had chosen to defy. Before she could form a response, a shadow fell across the doorway from within. Vokin stepped forward, his limp barely noticeable, his presence filling the space beside her. He was unarmed, clad only in his leggings and the bandages she had wrapped around his torso, but he stood with an unshakable stillness, his eyes fixed on the two trappers with an intensity that was more threatening than any weapon. The Callahan's eyes widened, first in shock, then in a vile, triumphant rage. "Well, I'll be—" Amos spat, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "A redskin. Hiding out with an Indian lover, are you? We heard stories about a Cheyenne buck getting cut up down by the river. Looks like we found him." The situation had escalated beyond her control. Her act of private compassion was now a public crime in their eyes. The men saw her not as a healer, but as a traitor to her own kind. Vokin understood the danger in their expressions, the poison in their words, even if he didn't know their meaning. He took a half step in front of Esther, a silent, protective gesture that only further enraged the brothers. "You best send him out," Garrett snarled, his own weapon now drawn, "or we'll burn this cabin down around the both of you." They stood there, a tense standoff at the edge of the wilderness. The brothers were driven by hate and greed, Esther by a fierce, newfound resolve, and Vokin by an ancient code of honor. He had brought this danger to her door, and he would not let her face it alone. The trappers eventually backed away, their threats hanging in the air like poison. "We'll be back," Amos promised. "And we'll bring friends. The town will want to hear about this." The aftermath of the confrontation was a heavy, somber silence. The immediate danger had passed, but a larger one loomed. Vokin knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that he had to leave. His presence was a brand on her, a mark that would bring violence and ostracization down upon her head. He began to gather his few things, the knife he had used for carving, a small pouch of herbs he had recognized from the woods. Esther watched him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She didn't want him to go. The thought of returning to the suffocating silence, the crushing loneliness, was unbearable. But she knew he was right. His departure was a painful necessity. As he stood by the door, ready to leave, he turned to her. He reached out and gently touched the faint lines of worry on her forehead, his gesture more articulate than any words could ever be. It was a touch of gratitude, of respect, of a sorrowful farewell. But fate, it seemed, had one more trial for them. As he opened the door, the Callahan brothers stood there, their faces contorted with malice. They had not gone for help. They had simply waited, their impatience and cruelty getting the better of them. Garrett lunged forward, grabbing for Esther. In that instant, everything changed. The passive widow, the grieving woman who had let life happen to her, vanished. With a cry of rage, Esther brought the stock of her rifle up, cracking it hard against Garrett's jaw. He staggered back, howling in pain. At the same time, Vokeen moved with the fluid grace of a striking snake. He was no longer a patient recovering from a wound. He was a warrior in his element. He disarmed Amos with a swift, brutal movement, sending the pistol flying into the dirt. The fight was short and savage. It was not a battle of equals, but a collision of calculated violence and desperate ferocity. Vokine used his skill, his speed, his intimate knowledge of combat. Esther used her knowledge of her home, kicking over a woodpile to trip one brother, using the heavy iron skillet from the hearth as a weapon against the other. They fought together, a seamless, unspoken partnership forged in the crucible of shared danger. They did not kill the Callahans. They broke them, leaving them battered and whimpering in the dirt, their arrogance shattered. "Go," Esther gasped, pointing the rifle at them. "And if you ever come back here, I will not be so merciful." The trappers scrambled away, disappearing into the twilight like the cowards they were. The threat was neutralized, but the victory was bittersweet. Now, his departure was not just necessary, it was cemented. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound, aching respect. He had seen her strength, her fire. He placed his hand over his heart, then extended it towards her, a gesture of honor, a promise. Then, without another look back, he limped into the darkening forest and was gone. Esther stood in the doorway of her silent cabin, the scent of violence still hanging in the air, and for the first time in a long time, she was truly, utterly alone again. But this time, the loneliness felt different. It was the quiet after a storm, not the stillness of a tomb. She had fought, and she had won. The seasons turned. Summer bled into the fiery colors of autumn, and autumn gave way to the stark, white silence of winter. Esther lived with the consequences of her choices. The Callahans, it seemed, had spread their poison. The few times she made the long ride to town for supplies, she was met with cold shoulders and hostile glares. Whispers followed her like shadows. She was the woman who had harbored a savage, the widow who had betrayed her own. The isolation she had once felt as a circumstance of geography now became a wall of prejudice, built brick by the fear and judgment of others. But something inside her had been reforged in the fire of that conflict. She no longer felt the passive sorrow that had defined her widowhood. She faced the town's contempt with a quiet dignity. She faced the harsh winter with a hardened resolve. The silence of her cabin was no longer an oppressive weight. It was filled with the echo of his presence, the memory of their shared fight for survival. She found herself speaking to him sometimes, her voice soft in the stillness, as if he were just in the next room. His memory was not a ghost that haunted her, it was a beacon that gave her strength. One day in early spring, when the snow was finally melting and the land was reawakening, she saw them, a procession of riders on the ridge overlooking her valley. At first, a cold dread seized her. She thought it was a war party, perhaps come to avenge the wounded warrior she had helped. She grabbed her rifle and stood her ground, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But as they drew closer, she saw they carried no signs of war. They rode slowly, deliberately, with a solemn purpose. At their head rode a man who sat his horse with an undeniable authority. He was dressed not in the simple leggings of a lone warrior, but in the magnificent regalia of a chief, full headdress of eagle feathers that trailed behind him, a breastplate of polished bone, and buckskins adorned with intricate quillwork. As he came nearer, her breath caught in her throat. Beneath the majesty of the chief, she recognized the eyes. They were the same dark, intelligent eyes that had watched her across the fire, the same eyes that had held a universe of unspoken pain and respect. It was Vokin. He halted his horse, a respectful distance from her cabin. Another warrior, slightly older, rode forward and dismounted. He spoke to her in halting, carefully pronounced English. "Our chief, Vokin, sends his greetings to the woman of the strong heart," the man said. "His father has journeyed to the spirit world. He is now chief of our people." Esther could only stare, speechless, at the man who had left her as a wounded fugitive and returned as a leader of his nation. Vokin dismounted and walked toward her. He stopped before her and spoke in his own tongue, his voice deep and resonant. The warrior translated. "He says he never forgot your courage. He says you saved his life, and then you fought beside him as a warrior would. He says his people value honor above all things. You have shown the greatest honor." Vokin looked at her, his expression serious and yet profoundly gentle. He continued to speak, his words translated in a soft cadence. "He says a chief must have a strong woman by his side, a woman with a heart as brave as any warrior, a woman who knows how to heal and how to fight, a woman who is not afraid." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "He asks you to leave this place of sorrow and judgment. He asks you to come with him, to be his wife, to be a mother to his people. He offers you a home where you will be honored, not shunned. He offers you a place at his side." Tears welled in Esther's eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming release. She looked at the small, lonely cabin, a place that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. She looked at the distant mountains that marked the way to town, a place that had offered her nothing but scorn. And then she looked at Vokin, the chief, her friend, the man who saw her not as a broken widow or a traitor, but as a woman of strength and worth. She needed no translator to give her answer. She simply walked forward and placed her hand in his. A smile, the first true, unguarded smile in years, touched her lips. She was leaving everything she had known behind, but she was not losing a thing. She was walking away from a life of silence and into a future of purpose. As she rode away from the cabin, seated on a horse beside her chief, she did not look back. She was no longer Esther Weston, the lonely widow of the high meadows. She was a woman who had found her resilience, her strength, and her home in the most unexpected of hearts. She was a queen in her own right, riding toward the dawn. The year was 1881, and the grief of the Cheyenne chief, Honyahaka, was a season unto itself. It had settled over the land his people occupied, a cold mist that clung to the valleys long after the sun had risen. It had been a year since he had buried his daughter, Mesa, a year since the laughter had been stolen from his lodge, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The world had continued its turning. The pines had shed and grown their needles. The creek had frozen and thawed, but Honyahaka's heart remained a frozen, desolate landscape. He performed his duties as chief with a hollowed-out precision, his decisions sound, his counsel wise, but his spirit was absent. It walked somewhere else, in the ghost lands of memory, forever chasing the shadow of a little girl with eyes like polished obsidian and a smile like the summer dawn. His people gave him space, a respectful distance that was its own kind of pain. They saw the way he would pause mid-sentence, his gaze lost on the horizon. They saw him walk the forest paths alone, his broad shoulders stooped with a burden no one could help him carry. The forest had once been a place of joy, where he had taught Mesa the names of the trees, the tracks of the deer, and the language of the wind. Now, it was a cathedral of his sorrow. Each rustle of leaves was a whisper of her name, each dappled patch of sunlight a reminder of her fleeting presence. He went there not for solace, but to steep himself in the ache, because the ache was all he had left of her. It was on one such day, with the autumn air crisp and smelling of pine and damp earth, that he found her. He was following a game trail that wound deep into the shadowed heart of the woods, a place few others ventured. He was not hunting. He was simply moving, trying to walk away from the stillness that haunted his lodge. A sound, thin and sharp, cut through the murmur of the forest. It was not the cry of a hawk or the complaint of a jay. It was a sound of distress, fragile and human. Honyahaka stopped, his head cocked, every sense honed by a lifetime in the wild. He moved toward the sound, his steps silent on the thick carpet of fallen needles. There, in a small clearing where a great oak had fallen long ago, was a small, huddled shape. At first, he thought it was a pale fawn, caught in a snare. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a child, a girl. She was backed against the rotting log, her small body trembling uncontrollably. But it was her appearance that made him freeze. Her hair was the color of winter frost, a stark, shocking white that cascaded around her shoulders in a tangled mess. Her skin was as pale as milk, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were the faint, watery blue of a sky just before a storm. An albino child. She was not of his people. She was a child of the white settlers, yet she was utterly alone. Her dress, a simple cotton frock, was torn and filthy. She was impossibly thin, the bones of her face sharp and delicate under her translucent skin. But it was the mark on her forearm that made a low growl rumble in Honyahaka's chest. Burned into her pale flesh was a crude, star-like symbol, the skin around it red, swollen, and weeping. A brand. They had marked her like cattle, like a thing to be owned and discarded. He knew what the settlers in the nearby town of Providence called people like her. They used words steeped in fear and ignorance. Witch. Devil spawn. The brand was a verdict, and the forest was her execution chamber. The child flinched, pulling her arm close as if to hide the mark. A whimper escaped her lips, a sound of pure terror. She saw not a man, but a towering figure of shadow and leather, a stranger whose presence meant only more pain. Honyahaka saw something else. He saw a child, no older than Mesa would have been. He saw the same fragile, bird-boned wrists, the same terrifying vulnerability. The grief that had been a cold, dead weight in his chest suddenly ignited with a white-hot spark of fury. Fury at the cruelty of the world, at the people who could do this to a child and call themselves righteous. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt. He made himself smaller, less threatening. He held out his empty hands, palms up, a gesture of peace his own daughter had understood. The silence of the forest pressed in around them, broken only by the child's ragged breathing. He stayed like that for a long time, a statue of patient sorrow, until the trembling in her small limbs began to subside, replaced by a weary exhaustion. The fight was leaving her. She had been alone for days, he guessed, with no food and little water. He remembered the strip of dried venison in his pouch. He pulled it out slowly, holding it toward her. She stared at it, her pale eyes wide with a mixture of hunger and suspicion. He placed it gently on the ground between them and retreated a step. Her gaze darted from the jerky to his face and back again. Finally, the gnawing emptiness in her belly won out. With a swift, furtive movement, she snatched the meat and crammed it into her mouth, chewing with a desperate ferocity. In that moment, the ice around Honyahaka's heart cracked. The grief was still there, a vast and aching sea, but on its shore, something new had washed up, a purpose. He could not save his own daughter from the fever that had stolen her away, but he could save this one from the hatred that had cast her out. He did not know her name. He did not know her story, beyond what the brand told him. It did not matter. He saw a daughter, and he would not leave her to die. He brought her back to his lodge, carrying her when her weak legs gave out. The journey was a silent one, the child a feather-light weight in his powerful arms, her white hair stark against the dark buckskin of his shirt. When he entered the village, a hush fell. Eyes followed him, filled with questions and a dawning unease. They saw the pale, otherworldly child he carried, and they saw the look on their chief's face, a look of grim determination they had not seen since before Mesa's passing. He took her into his lodge, the one that had been a tomb of memories, and gently closed the flap, shutting out the world and its judgment. For the first time in a year, Honyahaka was not entirely alone in his grief. He now had a small, terrified, and branded ghost to share it with. Inside the lodge, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and cedar. Honyahaka laid the girl on a soft buffalo robe near the central fire pit. She immediately curled into a tight ball, her strange, light eyes tracking his every move. He moved with a deliberate slowness, speaking to her in the soft, melodic tones of the Cheyenne tongue, knowing she would not understand the words, but hoping she would understand the intent. He brought her a bowl of cool water, which she drank thirstily, her small hands shaking. He knew he had to tend to the brand. It was a vile wound, and infection was already setting in. When he gently reached for her arm, she recoiled with a cry, scrambling away from him until her back hit the curved wall of the lodge. Fear, stark and absolute, radiated from her. He stopped, holding his hands up again. This would take a patience he wasn't sure he still possessed. He sat back on his heels, not moving, simply waiting. He began to hum a lullaby, the same one his mother had hummed to him, the same one he had hummed to Mesa when she was restless. It was a simple, repetitive melody, a sound of peace and safety. He hummed for what felt like an hour, his voice a low, steady drone against the crackle of the fire. The tension slowly bled from the girl's body. Her eyelids began to droop. She was fighting a battle between terror and total exhaustion. He prepared a poultice of chewed willow bark and yarrow, his movements economical and practiced. When he saw her eyes finally close, he moved toward her again, as silently as a hunting cat. This time, when he reached for her arm, she only flinched, too tired to resist further. He worked quickly, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound. The burn was deep, the edges ragged. The symbol was an affront, a mark of deepest ignorance. He applied the soothing poultice, the herbs immediately beginning their work of drawing out the heat and the poison. He wrapped her arm in a clean strip of soft doeskin. As he finished, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at her bandaged arm, then up at his face. There was no understanding in her expression, only a profound, bottomless weariness. He covered her with another fur, and within moments she was lost in a deep, troubled sleep. Honyahaka sat by the fire, watching her, the silence of the lodge no longer empty, but filled with the fragile presence of a life he had sworn to protect. The next few days established a quiet, fragile routine. The girl, whom he soon learned was named Lillian after she whispered it once in a feverish sleep, remained mostly silent. She ate the broth and softened meats he prepared for her, her hunger still ravenous. She watched him constantly, her pale eyes like a hawk's, assessing his every move. Honyahaka did not press her. He moved about the lodge, mending his tools, stretching a hide, his presence a steady, non-threatening constant. He left the lodge flap open during the day, so she could see the sky and hear the sounds of the village, so she would know she was not a prisoner. His people were divided. Wovoka, an elder whose eyes were clouded with the cataracts of age and superstition, spoke against the child's presence. "She is not of our blood," he warned in council. "She has the hair of a ghost and the skin of a corpse. The white men who cast her out are fearful of her power. Why would you bring that ill omen into your own lodge, Honyahaka? Your grief clouds your judgment." Others were more compassionate. A woman named Neva, whose own children were grown, saw only a child in need. "The chief's heart has been closed for a year," she argued softly. "This child has opened it. Is that not a powerful omen in itself? She is a helpless girl, not a spirit." Honyahaka listened to them all, his face impassive. When they had finished, he stood. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but held the unbreakable strength of granite. "I found her left for the wolves. She was branded for the crime of her birth. I will not do what her cruel people have done. She is a child. She has no one. Now she has me. She will remain in my lodge. She is under my protection." He looked directly at Wovoka. "My judgment is clear. It is my heart that was clouded. It is beginning to see again." There was no further argument. The chief had spoken, and his word was law. Slowly, tentatively, Lillian began to emerge from her shell of fear. One morning, Honyahaka was carving a piece of cottonwood, his knife shaping the form of a small horse. It was an idle habit, something to keep his hands busy. He had carved dozens of such figures for Mesa. He finished the horse, smoothing its edges with a piece of sandstone, and placed it on the floor near where Lillian sat. He did not look at her or say a word. He simply left it there and went about his tasks. For a long time, she did not move. Then, when she thought he was not looking, a small, pale hand reached out and tentatively touched the wooden horse. Her fingers traced its shape, and for the first time since he had found her, Honyahaka saw something other than fear or exhaustion on her face. It was a flicker of childlike wonder. He began to teach her words. He would point to the fire and say, "Ista," to the water and say, "Mni." She was a quick study, her young mind a thirsty sponge. She would repeat the words in a small, hushed voice, her pronunciation clumsy but earnest. In return, she taught him a few of her own. "Fire," she whispered one evening, pointing. "Water." It was a bridge being built, word by word, across a chasm of culture and pain. The turning point came one night when a fierce thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and thunder cracked the sky open. Honyahaka was woken by a small, trembling body pressing against his back. It was Lillian. She had crawled from her own sleeping furs, terrified of the violent sounds. He did not say anything. He simply shifted, making room for her, and pulled the heavy buffalo robe over her small frame. She burrowed against him, her small hands clutching his buckskin shirt. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. He began to hum the old lullaby, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's fury. He hummed until her trembling subsided and her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. In the dark, with the storm raging outside, he realized this was the first time she had willingly sought him out for comfort. This small act of trust was more powerful than any treaty, more meaningful than any council debate. He was no longer just her rescuer, he was becoming her safe harbor. News of the white spirit child in the Cheyenne chief's lodge traveled on the wind, carried by trappers and traders to the muddy streets of Providence. The town was a raw collection of clapboard buildings huddled against the vastness of the prairie, a place where faith and fear were often indistinguishable. It was a community that had recently suffered a bout of lung fever, and their meager corn crop was withering from a lack of rain. They needed someone to blame. Garrett Vance was the man who gave their fear a voice. He was not a preacher, but he spoke like one, his words filled with fire and damnation. He was a stern, unforgiving man whose authority was built on the superstitions of his neighbors. He had been the one to pronounce Lillian a witch, the one who had held her down while another man heated the branding iron. He had seen her pale skin and hair not as a natural curiosity, but as a mark of Cain, an unnatural blight upon God's world. He had convinced the townsfolk that her presence was the source of their misfortune. Leaving her in the woods was not murder in his eyes, it was a cleansing. When he heard she was alive, living among the savages, his rage was biblical. It was a perversion of the natural order. He saw it as a test of his authority and his faith. He began to preach in the town square, his voice ringing with righteous fury. He spoke of the devil consorting with the heathen, of a curse that had not been purged, but had merely found a new home. "That creature has tainted them," he roared, his face red with exertion. "She is a pestilence. As long as she draws breath, our crops will fail, and our children will sicken. The Lord demands we retrieve what is his and purify it with fire." His words found fertile ground in the anxious hearts of the townsfolk. A posse was formed, a grim collection of farmers and shopkeepers armed with rifles and a self-righteous certainty. They were not warriors, but fear made them dangerous. They rode out from Providence at dawn, a dark line of men moving across the prairie. Their destination, the Cheyenne village, their purpose to reclaim the witch child and finish what they had started. Word of their approach came from a young Cheyenne hunter who had seen the dust cloud from a high ridge. The village stirred like a disturbed anthill. Warriors took up their rifles and bows, their faces set in hard lines. Women gathered the children, their expressions anxious. This was the moment Wovoka had warned of. The child had brought trouble. Honyahaka stood before his lodge, watching the preparations. Lillian, now called Vavina by the tribe, a name meaning fawn, for her quiet, watchful nature, stood beside him. She understood enough of the commotion to be terrified. She clutched his hand, her knuckles white. He looked down at her frightened, upturned face, and felt a protective instinct so fierce it was a physical force. This was not about an omen or a curse. This was about a father protecting his daughter. He handed his rifle to a young warrior. "No one fires unless I give the word," he commanded. He would not meet violence with violence, not yet. He would meet them as a chief. He walked to the edge of the village, alone and unarmed, and waited. The posse reined in their horses 100 yards away, their faces a mixture of bravado and unease. Garrett Vance dismounted, his long duster coat swirling around his boots. He strode forward, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "Honyahaka," Vance's voice was a harsh bark. "We've come for the child. She is an abomination, a curse on this land. Give her to us, and there will be no trouble between our peoples." Honyahaka remained still, a figure of immense, unshakable calm. "The child you speak of is my daughter," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. It was the first time he had said the words aloud, and they settled into his soul with the weight of absolute truth. "Her name is Vavina. She is of my lodge, and under my protection." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your daughter, you would claim a demon as your own. She has brought sickness to our town. The Lord has marked her as unclean." "It was not your Lord who marked her," Honyahaka replied, his voice dropping, becoming as cold and sharp as river ice. "It was you, Vance, with hot iron." He took a step forward. "You speak of a curse. I will show you a curse." He turned and beckoned toward his lodge. After a moment's hesitation, Vavina emerged, walking on trembling legs to his side. She hid behind him, peeking out at the line of armed men. Honyahaka gently took her left arm, the one with the brand, and held it out for them to see. The wound had healed into a puckered, ugly scar, a permanent mutilation on her pale skin. "This is your work," he said, his voice resonating with a profound, grieving authority. "This is the mark of your God, a God who fears a child. A God who demands you burn the skin of the innocent." He looked past Vance, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the other men. Many of them were fathers themselves. They shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping from the sight of the scarred little arm. "I, too, have lost a daughter," Honyahaka continued, his voice thick with a pain that was raw and universal. "I know what it is to have a hole in your spirit that can never be filled. But my grief did not teach me to hate. It did not teach me to fear a child who is different. You speak of sickness. The only sickness I see here is in your hearts. It is a sickness of fear and cruelty." He drew Vavina close, shielding her with his body. He stood straight and tall, the chief of his people, a father defending his own. "This child is my daughter now. Her home is here. If you wish to take her, you must come through me, and you must come through every one of my warriors." He gestured to the silent line of men who had fanned out behind him, their weapons ready. "Leave now. Go back to your town and pray to your God. Pray that he forgives you for what you have done, for I will not." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The men of the posse looked at each other, their righteous certainty crumbling into shame and doubt. They saw not a heathen chief spouting empty threats, but a man of profound dignity. They saw a small, scarred child cowering behind him. They saw the unwavering resolve of the Cheyenne warriors. The odds had changed. This was not a simple matter of purging a curse anymore. This would be a bloody fight, and for what? For the right to harm a child. One by one, the men lowered their rifles. One of them turned his horse and began to ride away. Then another, Garrett Vance, stood alone, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He had lost control. His crusade had dissolved in the face of a father's love and a chief's quiet strength. He spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hatred for Honyahaka, but he was beaten. He turned and stormed back to his horse, swinging himself into the saddle. Without a backward glance, he galloped away, his remaining posse trailing behind him like a tattered flag of defeat. The immediate threat had passed. The air in the Cheyenne village, which had been thick with tension, slowly cleared. The warriors lowered their weapons. Honyahaka stood for a long moment, watching the dust settle on the horizon. He felt Vivina's small hand tighten in his. He knelt and looked into her eyes. The terror was gone, replaced by an expression of awe and a dawning, absolute trust. She had seen him stand against the world for her. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back toward his lodge. As he walked, he passed the elder, Wovoka. The old man met his gaze and gave a slow, deep nod. It was a gesture of respect, an admission of error. He saw now that the child was not an ill omen. She was the medicine Honyahaka's wounded spirit had needed. She had not brought weakness, she had reminded their chief of his own formidable strength. In the weeks and months that followed, a new equilibrium settled over the village and within Honyahaka's soul. Vivina blossomed under his care. The haunted, feral look in her eyes was replaced by the bright curiosity of a healthy child. Her laughter, at first a rare and startling sound, became a common music within the lodge. She learned the Cheyenne language fluently, though she always retained the soft accent of her birth tongue. The people of the village accepted her. Neva taught her to bead moccasins, and the other children, seeing her not as a ghost, but as the chief's daughter, included her in their games. She was different, yes, but she was one of them. Honyahaka was transformed. The heavy cloak of his grief had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. It had become a part of the tapestry of his life, a dark thread that made the brighter ones seem all the more vibrant. He led his people with renewed vigor and wisdom, his heart open again. He taught Vivina the things he had once taught Mesa: how to read the clouds, how to find the sweetest berries, the stories of the stars. The memories of his first daughter were no longer just a source of pain. They were lessons, legacies he could pass on to the daughter he had been given. Sometimes, when he watched Vivina run through the tall prairie grass, her white hair flying behind her like a banner of sunlight, he would see a ghostly image of Mesa running beside her. And for the first time, the vision did not bring a tear to his eye. It brought a quiet smile to his lips. He had not replaced the daughter he had lost. He had simply made his heart big enough to love another. One cool evening, years later, he and Vivina sat outside the lodge, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. She was a young woman now, strong and graceful, her pale features a unique and beautiful counterpoint to the rich culture she had embraced as her own. She rested her head on his shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. "Father," she said softly, using the Cheyenne word, "do you ever think of them, the people in the town?" Honyahaka gazed into the crackling fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. He thought of Garrett Vance and the hard-faced men who had ridden with him. He felt no hatred, only a distant pity. "They were afraid," he said simply. "Fear makes people do terrible things. They looked at you and saw a monster because they did not have the courage to see a child." He looked at her, his expression full of a deep and abiding love. "They threw away a treasure because they could not see its worth. Their loss was my greatest gift." He had found her in the deepest winter of his soul, a child branded by hatred and abandoned to the wilderness. But to him, the grieving Cheyenne chief, she was not the witch they had named her. She was the daughter of his heart, the unexpected spring that had brought his world back to life. Together, they had built a home not of blood, but of fierce, protective lover bond, stronger than any prejudice. A testament to the resilience of a spirit to heal and find its purpose in the most unexpected of places.